They told him no one would believe him. But today, in front of a judge, Kendrick Stokes wasn't staying silent anymore. The air in the courtroom was thick with routine. Papers shuffled, pens scratched against legal pads, and the quiet murmur of attorneys exchanging last-minute notes filled the space, the kind of day where no one expected anything unusual. Just another juvenile case, another procedural step, another boy lost in the system. Then Kendrick Stokes spoke. "The cops beat me." His voice was steady, but the words landed like a slap. The sound of it cut through the courtroom like a sharp knife. A second of absolute silence followed, so quiet that even the buzzing overhead lights seemed muted. Judge Marianne Dunham sat motionless, her gavel resting near her fingertips. The woman was known for her no-nonsense demeanor, a judge who rarely reacted to outbursts. But this was different. Her gaze locked onto Kendrick, searching his face, reading something in his expression that the legal system often failed to see. Pain, fear, and something else. Determination. Across the room, Officer Brent Callowell shifted in his seat. The very officer who had arrested Kendrick. His jaw clenched, his eyes flickered, but he said nothing. The defense attorney, a sharp-looking man with silver at his temples, leaned forward. His lips parted, maybe to object, maybe to dismiss Kendrick's words as just another desperate attempt from a scared kid. But he hesitated, because Kendrick wasn't crying. He wasn't stammering. He was looking straight at the judge. At the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Dana Hollowell set her pen down. Not gently, deliberately. A sign that for the first time in this case, she was actually paying attention. Kendrick's guardian, Ms. Bernice Lowry, stiffened beside him. She had told him to stay quiet, that it was safer to let the lawyers handle everything, that speaking out might make things worse. But now she was gripping the edge of her chair, her breath held tight in her chest. "Kendrick," Judge Dunham said, her voice even. "Repeat that." Kendrick swallowed, his small hands clenched into fists on the worn wooden table. His knuckles were white. His voice didn't waver. "The cops beat me." Somewhere in the back a court officer cleared his throat. The sound felt unnaturally loud in the silence. The judge glanced toward the prosecution. "Ms. Hollowell, was this in the reports?" The ADA pursed her lips. She had read Kendrick's file. A standard arrest report, vague on details, nothing out of the ordinary. But now she was seeing the boy differently. The bruise just under his collarbone, barely visible beneath his too big dress shirt. The way his shoulders tensed like he was waiting for someone to tell him to stop talking. "There was no mention of excessive force, Your Honor," she said finally. Judge Dunham turned her attention back to Kendrick. "You're saying the arresting officers used force against you?" Kendrick nodded. Then his gaze flickered, just for a second, to Officer Callowell. Callowell shifted again. Judge Dunham noticed. So did Kendrick. "I'm saying," Kendrick's voice was quieter now but just as clear, "that they didn't want me to talk about it." The tension in the room thickened. No one moved. No one dared. The defense attorney finally found his voice. "Objection, Your Honor." "Overruled," the judge said immediately, her eyes still on Kendrick. Because something told her this was just the beginning. But what Kendrick was about to say next would change everything. Kendrick exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly they ached. He knew what came next. The part where the adults tried to twist his words, where they made him feel like he was crazy, like he was making things up, but he wasn't. He glanced at the judge. Her eyes locked on him, waiting. She hadn't dismissed him yet. That was something. Kendrick took a breath and went back to the night it happened. It was late. Too late for a kid to be out, but he wasn't doing anything wrong. He had been at his friend DeAndre's house, just a couple of blocks away from his own. They had been playing video games, the kind where time disappeared fast, and before he knew it, the streetlights were buzzing and the sidewalks were empty. So he took the shortcut home, a familiar path. He barely made it halfway down the alley when the red and blue lights flashed behind him. A cop car slowed to a crawl, then stopped. Kendrick froze. He knew how this looked. A kid walking alone, hands stuffed in his hoodie pocket. The wrong time of night. 2 officers stepped out. One of them was Callowell. The other, Officer Riley Denton, was taller, older, the kind who didn't say much but always had his hand near his belt. Kendrick pulled his hands out of his pockets immediately, fingers spread. "Hey, kid," Callowell said, like they were old friends. "Where you coming from?" "Home," Kendrick lied. He didn't want to explain himself, didn't want to say his friend's name, didn't want to be the reason somebody else's mum got a late-night knock at the door. Callowell didn't look convinced. "What's in your pockets?" "Nothing. You mind if we check?" Kendrick hesitated. He knew his rights, sort of. He knew he could say no, but saying no never really meant no when it came to people like them. Still, he took a step back. "I didn't do anything." Denton sighed, shaking his head. "See, I don't like that," he muttered, like Kendrick had just personally offended him. "I don't like when they act like that." Kendrick's pulse quickened. Callowell's face darkened. "You think we're out here just picking on you?" "No," Kendrick answered quickly. But it didn't matter. Before he could react, Callowell grabbed his wrist. Hard. Panic shot through Kendrick's chest. He twisted instinctively, trying to yank free, but Callowell's grip only tightened. "Now you're resisting." "I'm not." Then Denton shoved him against the wall. The cold brick scraped against Kendrick's cheek as a hand pressed hard against the back of his head. He sucked in a breath, his heart pounding. "I didn't do anything," Kendrick gasped. "Stop resisting." Resisting what? A fist drove into his ribs. Hard. Pain exploded through his side, and Kendrick's knees buckled. The breath left his lungs in a single sharp wheeze. They weren't asking him questions anymore. They were teaching him a lesson. The punches weren't wild or uncontrolled. They were calculated, just enough to hurt, not enough to leave marks where it mattered. Then, just like that, it was over. Callowell straightened, his breathing even. Denton adjusted his belt. "You're lucky we're in a good mood tonight," Callowell muttered. And then the handcuffs clicked around Kendrick's wrists. He wasn't even sure what they were charging him with. Didn't matter. Because when the cruiser pulled away from the curb, Kendrick knew one thing for sure. Nobody would believe him. But now, in the courtroom, they had no choice but to listen. Kendrick's voice trailed off, but the courtroom still felt like it was holding its breath. He could hear the faint scratching of the stenographer's keys, the distant hum of traffic outside, but inside this room, all eyes were on him. Judge Dunham tapped her fingers against her desk, thinking. She had seen a lot in her years on the bench, kids who lied to save themselves, kids who told half-truths because they were scared. But Kendrick? He wasn't stammering. He wasn't scrambling for words. He was remembering. The prosecution attorney, Dinah Hollowell, folded her arms, her gaze shifting between Kendrick and Officer Callowell. She had worked cases like this before, reports that didn't match the bruises, patrol cameras that somehow malfunctioned at the right moment, the way some officers held power like a weapon. But that didn't mean she could just believe a kid's word over an officer's. The silence stretched. Then Callowell cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, voice level, controlled. "This is completely untrue." His attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy blue suit, nodded along. "Judge, we can't allow wild accusations like this. If the boy was mistreated, why wasn't it mentioned before today?" The words felt like a slap, but Kendrick stayed still. He knew they'd say that. He knew this was how it worked. The people who did things like this always counted on kids like him to stay quiet. But Kendrick wasn't staying quiet anymore. "You're saying he made this up?" Judge Dunham asked, watching Callowell closely. "I'm saying there's no record of any excessive force," Callowell replied smoothly. "And I find it odd that he's only bringing it up now." Kendrick's fingers curled into his sleeves. "Of course there was no record." "You want a reason?" Kendrick spoke up. His voice was steady, even though his chest felt tight. "Because they told me no one would believe me." Callowell's expression barely shifted. "We never said that." But Kendrick didn't even look at him. He looked at the judge. "Before they put me in the car," he said, "they told me I could say whatever I wanted. But in the end, my word wouldn't mean anything against theirs." Callowell's attorney gave a small laugh, shaking his head. Your Honor, this is getting ridiculous. We can't just— Did you file a complaint, Kendrick? Hollowell interrupted. Kendrick hesitated. I didn't know how, he admitted. And even if I did, who was I supposed to tell? The cops. The room was silent again. Callowell's jaw tightened. His hands flexed against his thighs, but he forced himself to stay composed. Hollowell exhaled slowly, her eyes shifting toward Judge Dunham. Your Honor, I request access to all available bodycam footage from the night of Kendrick's arrest. Kendrick's stomach clenched. The footage. He didn't know what would be on it. He didn't know if the cameras had been rolling, or if they had been accidentally switched off, the way they sometimes were. But what he did know— if that footage was missing, it would say more than any testimony ever could. Judge Dunham nodded once. Motion granted. Kendrick barely breathed. He could feel Callowell's gaze on him, unreadable, calculating. Because no matter what that footage showed, or didn't show, this wasn't over. But Kendrick had just forced them to play a game they never expected to lose. The request for bodycam footage changed everything. Before that moment, Kendrick felt like just another kid being talked over in a courtroom filled with people who had already made up their minds. But now, they had to listen. Judge Dunham leaned forward, elbows resting on her bench. While we wait on that request, Kendrick, I want you to walk us through exactly what happened. Every detail. Kendrick's mouth felt dry, but he nodded. The night I got arrested, he started, his voice steady. I was heading home. I wasn't running. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I didn't even see them at first. He paused. Callowell was watching him, but Kendrick refused to look at him. They pulled up behind me. Asked me where I was going, what was in my pockets. I told them nothing. I told them I didn't do anything. His hands clenched together in his lap. That's when Callowell grabbed me. I pulled back. Not because I was fighting, but because I was scared. Then the other officer, Denton, shoved me against the wall, told me to stop resisting. He heard the defense attorney exhale sharply, probably getting ready to object, but Judge Dunham lifted a hand, stopping him before he could speak. Kendrick kept going. I told them I wasn't resisting. I said it over and over, didn't matter. I felt something hit my ribs, a punch. Not a push, not an accident. A punch. Hard enough to knock the air out of me. He shifted slightly in his chair, his side still sore from that night. I couldn't breathe. They said I was lucky they were in a good mood. Then they cuffed me, put me in the car, and Denton told me something. Kendrick finally looked at Callowell. He said I could talk all I wanted, but in the end, people like you always win. Silence. No scribbling from the stenographer. No murmurs from the crowd. Just the weight of Kendrick's words hanging in the air. Judge Dunham studied Callowell. Officer Callowell, did you have your body cam on during this arrest? Callowell exhaled through his nose, expression blank. Standard procedure is to activate body cams during public interactions. She narrowed her eyes. That wasn't my question. Callowell's lawyer sat forward. Your Honor, we won't be answering any further questions until we've reviewed the footage ourselves. Of course. Because they already knew what that footage would, or wouldn't, show. Kendrick felt his pulse in his ears. This was the moment. He could back down. Let them bury the truth like they always did. Or he could keep going. He swallowed, forcing his voice to stay steady. If that footage is gone, he said, it's because they don't want you to see it. Callowell's jaw twitched. Hollowell looked at Kendrick, then at the officer, her lips pressing together like she was piecing something together in her head. Judge Dunham tapped a finger against her desk. We'll review the footage. Her gaze flicked to Kendrick. In the meantime, son, is there anything else you want to say? Kendrick thought about that night. The bricks against his face, the weight of a boot pressing into his back, the way Denton had laughed when he gasped for air. And how, when they finally put him in the car, Callowell had been the one to turn off the camera. He looked the judge dead in the eye. No, he said. I think I've said enough. But deep down, Kendrick knew. The truth had just started to come out. The room felt different now, heavier, like the weight of Kendrick's words had settled over everyone, making it impossible to ignore what had just been said. Judge Dunham didn't move for a long moment. Then she exhaled and turned to the prosecution. Ms. Hollowell, how long will it take to retrieve the footage? Hollowell glanced at one of her aides, who quickly tapped into a laptop. After a few seconds, the aide whispered something in her ear. Hollowell's lips pressed into a thin line. Your Honor, she said, shifting in her seat. According to the department's logs, Officer Callowell's body cam footage from that night is missing. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Kendrick's stomach twisted, not because he was surprised, but because he already knew this was how it would play out. Judge Dunham's expression remained unreadable. Missing? Hollowell gave a slow nod. There's a report that states his camera malfunctioned during the arrest and was later found to be corrupted. Kendrick let out a bitter breath through his nose. The defense attorney, sensing an opening, straightened his tie. Your Honor, this is exactly why we shouldn't be taking the word of a child at face value. Accusations like these are serious, and without hard evidence, we're relying on speculation. Kendrick had enough. You don't need a video, he interrupted, his voice louder than before. Just look at me. The defense attorney turned toward him, clearly irritated. Excuse me. Kendrick pushed up the sleeve of his button-down. The bruises weren't as dark as they had been that night, but they were still there. Yellowing fingerprints on his wrist. A faint but deep bruise along his forearm where Callowell had grabbed him. The room went quiet again. Judge Dunham's eyes darkened. Did anyone at the station document these injuries? Kendrick shook his head. No one asked. No one cared. Judge Dunham's fingers tapped against her desk again, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Hollowell cleared her throat. Your Honor, I'd like to motion for an immediate internal review of Officer Callowell's conduct, including a forensic analysis of any available dashcam footage or third-party recordings in the area that night. The defense attorney scoffed. This is turning into a circus. We don't even know if those injuries came from the night of the arrest. Kendrick clenched his fists. He was tired of this. Tired of watching grown men in suits try to talk around the truth, try to spin it until it was no longer about what happened, but about how well they could deny it. But just when it seemed like the case was about to get buried in technicalities, a voice spoke from the back of the courtroom. I saw what happened. Every head turned. A man stood near the entrance, hesitant but firm. Mid-40s, dark skin, tired eyes. He looked at Kendrick, then at the judge. I was there that night, he continued. I saw the cops stop that boy, and I saw what they did. The courtroom erupted. The defense attorney immediately objected. Callowell stiffened in his seat. Hollowell whipped around, already signaling her team to verify the man's identity. But Kendrick, he just stared. Because for the first time since this all started, he wasn't alone, and that changed everything. Kendrick barely breathed. The man at the back of the courtroom stood firm, his hands shoved into the pockets of a worn-out bomber jacket. He glanced around nervously, probably second-guessing whether he should have spoken up at all. Judge Dunham was the first to address him. State your name. He hesitated. Then with a slow breath he said, Reggie Samuels. The name meant nothing to Kendrick, but the way Callowell shifted in his chair told him everything he needed to know. Callowell recognized him. Hollowell straightened, flipping through her files. Mr. Samuels, are you saying you witnessed Kendrick Stokes' arrest? Reggie gave a single nod. I live on that block. I was walking back from my sister's house when I saw the police pull up on him. The defense attorney groaned, rubbing his temples. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We can't just take the word of a random bystander who... Dunham lifted a hand. Let him speak. The room stilled again. Reggie cleared his throat. I didn't think much of it at first. Cops stop kids all the time, right? But then I saw how they handled him. His voice tightened. They weren't talking to him like a kid. They were talking down to him, like they had already decided he was guilty of something. Kendrick swallowed. That part wasn't even the worst of it. I saw one of them grab him. The kid barely pulled back, barely moved at all. And the next thing I knew, they had him against the wall. Hollowell stepped closer. Did you see them strike him? Reggie hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, one of them. He glanced at Callowell, his jaw tightening. Him. All eyes turned to Callowell. He didn't flinch, didn't react, but Kendrick saw it. The tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers curled into his pant leg. Hollowell turned back to Reggie. "And you're willing to testify to this under oath?" Reggie took another deep breath, like he knew once he said the next words. There was no taking them back. "I'll swear on whatever you need me to." The courtroom erupted again. Low murmurs, gasps, shifting bodies. This wasn't just an accusation anymore. This was a case. The defense attorney shot up. "This is absurd. A man off the street suddenly remembers witnessing police misconduct months after the fact." He turned to Judge Dunham. "Your Honor, this is getting out of hand. There's no proof this man was even there." "I was there," Reggie snapped. "Just because it took me this long to come forward doesn't mean it didn't happen." Dunham's gaze hardened. "Enough." The room silenced again. She turned to Hollowell. "Can we verify Mr. Samuel's presence at the scene that night?" Hollowell's aide was already typing on the laptop. After a few beats, she leaned in and whispered something to the prosecutor. Hollowell's face shifted. Then she looked at the judge. "Your Honor, according to city surveillance, Mr. Samuel's cell phone was pinged near the scene of the arrest that night. Additionally," she turned to Callowell, "dashcam footage from another patrol vehicle confirms he was there, standing across the street." Kendrick's heart pounded. This was it. They couldn't ignore this. Judge Dunham leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Mr. Samuels, you'll be added to the witness list. We'll reconvene after a full review of all available evidence." She turned to Callowell. "Officer Callowell, you are now under formal investigation." For the first time, Callowell looked nervous. Because he knew the truth was catching up, and there was no running from it. The weight in the courtroom had shifted. For so long, Kendrick had felt like a kid trapped in a system that had already made up its mind about him. A system that saw his age, his skin, and the neighborhood he lived in before it ever saw him. But now, for the first time, it wasn't just his word against theirs. Judge Dunham tapped a pen against her desk, her expression unreadable. "We'll take a recess while the prosecution and defense review the new witness testimony and additional footage." She turned to Kendrick. "Mr. Stokes, you may step down." He hesitated, still gripping the wooden table, his knuckles tight. The judge had said his name like it meant something, like he wasn't just another case number. He nodded once and slid back into his chair next to Ms. Lowry, his guardian. Across the room, Officer Callowell sat stiff, his hands clasped together. His lawyer leaned in close, whispering something, probably damage control. Kendrick wasn't stupid. Even if the court ruled in his favor, Callowell and Denton wouldn't be thrown in a cell the way he had been. There were layers to this, protections built into the system for people like them, but that didn't mean they could walk away untouched. And that's what Kendrick was holding on to. The judge signaled for recess, and the courtroom buzzed as people stood, stretching, whispering, waiting. Ms. Lowry placed a hand on Kendrick's shoulder. "You okay?" He wasn't sure how to answer that. So much of his life had been shaped by moments like this, things happening to him, decisions being made about him, and him just existing in the middle of it all. But today, he had made them listen. The prosecution and defense gathered near the judge's bench, whispering in low voices. The court bailiff kept an eye on Callowell, his posture unusually stiff. Then Judge Dunham returned. The courtroom fell back into silence as she took her seat. "Court is now back in session." Hollowell stood, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, after reviewing the new testimony and evidence, the prosecution is officially recommending that the charges against Mr. Stokes be dropped." A murmur spread across the room. The defense attorney's mouth tightened, but he didn't object. Probably knew there was nothing left to say. Judge Dunham turned to Kendrick. "Mr. Stokes, as of now, you are no longer facing charges. Your case is dismissed." Kendrick felt his chest tighten. It was over. But the judge wasn't done. She shifted her attention to Callowell. "Furthermore, due to discrepancies in the arrest report and the now missing body cam footage, I am ordering an independent inquiry into Officers Callowell and Denton's conduct that night." Callowell's jaw tensed. This was more than just bad PR. An internal review meant investigations, hearings, a possible suspension. Denton wasn't even here to defend himself, and Kendrick knew why. "Officer Callowell, do you have anything to say?" Callowell hesitated. His lawyer whispered something, but the officer didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. Judge Dunham nodded once. "Then court is adjourned." The gavel hit the desk. Kendrick sat still as people began standing, as the murmurs grew louder. He should have felt relief. Maybe he did. But mostly, he just felt tired. Miss Lowry squeezed his shoulder. "Let's go home." He stood, glancing once more at Callowell. The officer didn't look at him. He wasn't free yet. Not really. Kendrick knew this wasn't the end. Because for every case like his, there were 100 more that never made it this far. But today, he won. And that meant something. Some people go their whole lives without ever being believed, without ever getting the chance to prove the truth. Kendrick got his chance. But how many others don't? The justice system wasn't built for kids like him. But that doesn't mean they should be silent. If you believe stories like Kendrick's need to be heard, share this video. Let people know, because sometimes the only thing stronger than power is the truth.